A moment of significant change or a turning point, altering your course, is known as an inflection point. In business, these moments have a significant impact in many ways. That's why we're speaking with leaders from across the asset management industry to hear the stories of their inflection points and the impact they've had on their journeys. Join me and my colleague Mark Spina as we explore the business of being in business, with insights that can help you wherever you may find yourself. This is Inflection Points. Good afternoon, Mark. Thanks so much for joining me on Inflection Points.
Thank you for having me, Jillian. Appreciate it.
Wonderful. For our listeners, I am so excited to be joined this afternoon by Mark Bruno, Managing Director of the Wealth Management Group at Informa. I think as our listeners have probably started to recognize here on Inflection Points, we really love to get into inflection points that happen throughout the life and career of our guests, right? What has been an impact on them, both personally and professionally, and brought them to where they are today. And I think with Mark, as we'll hear as we go through your background, I think Mark has a really unique lens on the RIA market in particular, the wealth management business. And so I want to get his thoughts on inflection points we've seen in that business. I used to spend a lot of time calling on RIAs in my time in distribution, and find it to be a fascinating, very entrepreneurial driven part of wealth management. And it certainly has experienced its own inflection points up to and including what we see happening in that market today. So maybe just to kick off, I would love to just sort of hear a little bit about your younger years, any formative inflection points, sort of as you look back, whether it's friends, family, schools, that sort of kicked you into where you may have started to get into your professional career.
I appreciate that, and I appreciate you allowing me to remember that I had young years.
Right.
No, it's a great question, and I'm glad you asked. I think we tend to just get right into it when we're talking about whether it's a wealth management business or what's going on in the RIA space.
Yeah.
Without really sort of getting a good understanding of like what motivated us all to get into it in the first place. And I think for me, early on, just thinking of inflection points, I got into media and publishing and events just because I was always interested in research and data. I was interested in money, no question, right? But really more the influence that it had or could have, positive, right, or negative. And I think I started probably oddly to get triggered or have that sort of interest in it when I was maybe 11 or 12 years old. It was always like you'd imagine, interested in sports and the most sort of traditional things. Motivated by winning and losing, just like things that had really clear outcomes. But I started to fall in love with music and playing guitar when I was 11 or 12, and it was a completely different experience for me because it wasn't about winning or losing. It wasn't about being the best. It was really more about mastery and things like that. Right? Just kind of learning to do something better and better with every minute, every hour that you put into it, and feeling like you really have ownership and command over something, and that you can create ultimately your own voice, right? So that's something that's always carried through with me. Still, playing music today, not as much as I would like to, but 20s, 30s, it was always very important for me. Always just a good outlet, and also just a way to just sort of express yourself without always using words and numbers, right? How does that translate to where I am now? It's not a linear path. Very few things really are. But it really kind of comes back to, I discovered at an early age that one of my motivators wasn't just winning, losing, making lots of money, things like that. It's mastery. And that's kind of what got me into financial services, journalism, publishing, and research, right? Being able to spend time with numbers, doing research, doing analysis, and then present findings, or more importantly, intelligence, right? Not just data, but intelligence. That helps people do their jobs more effectively, that helps people have a better understanding or a different way of seeing the world. That's how I've always sort of been drawn to first journalism, right? And then sort of the business of media research and publishing. So I'm glad you asked the question because I hadn't really thought of it before.
I think that's absolutely fascinating.
Day-to-day stuff, right?
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely fascinating. And I do think being a musician can be humbling. As you make your way towards that mastery. And I've actually talked to quite a few folks in our industry that are musicians. It's interesting to sort of see these connection points of what maybe drives certain people to get to where they are today. And maybe we can pivot there. I love the word mastery, by the way. I just wrote that down. I think that certainly will play a theme as we go through your different phases. But if we bring ourselves up into the professional realm, what were some of those original inflection points, right? That took you into journalism. We'll ultimately get to the inflection point that you had leaving journalism necessarily and taking that stop off in research. But what were some of those initial catalysts for you to get into journalism?
Yeah, I think the first thing was the simplest. Like I've always loved writing, and I felt like if I was going to get a job after I graduated college, that was the one thing that I felt like I could do really well, and that someone was willing to pay me for.
Yeah.
And I actually started doing lots of community journalism, right, which was an amazing experience for a couple of years. Had nothing to do with business.
Community journalism, like writing for your community paper, or what does that mean?
So I grew up on Long Island, came back here and was really kind of covering a lot of the news in Nassau County. And it was great because it gives you a lens into politics, business, education, really just a community in its entirety. And I think it's the Hemingway rule too. If you do 2 years at a community paper, you've met every character you'll ever need to write the great novel, right? So it was an amazing experience for me. But more than anything, I just kind of wanted to get into. I was always intrigued by the financial services industry. So after getting my footing, right, understanding how to work, how to go into sit in a desk, right, beat deadlines,
very different.
Moved into the banking space, asset management. It was a hard transition at first. I remember my editor, who was a longtime business editor at the New York Times before he moved over to work for some of these banking publications, asking me to write my first story was about syndicated lending.
Oh my gosh!
And I was like, "That's great. What's syndicated lending?" He's like, "All right, it's when a bunch of banks get together, right, and they all build a loan, and it's one portfolio of multiple banks." I'm like, "That's great. What's a portfolio?"
Talk about baptism by fire.
Going into it, right?
Yeah.
But like anything, I realized very quickly just how powerful it could be to go narrow and really deep. So I actually just really focused on banking first, right?
Okay.
Then bank technology, and then asset management, and then over time wealth management, right? So having that view into how the financial services industry works, right? The various channels within the ecosystem. I actually fell in love with the wealth management space because I realized the impact that financial advisors often have or can have on the lives of their clients. And that, to me, as much as I loved writing about institutional asset management and liability-driven investment strategies, right? I felt like I wanted to get something closer to something that was more human. And that's really what the wealth management industry, for me, presented, not just career opportunities, but the opportunity. I look at what I'm doing now, what I've been doing for the last 10 to 15 years. If I can help any financial advisor deliver better services or better outcomes, right, to their clients, then I'm good. So it all kind of ties back to the concept of mastery. It's not necessarily doing it better than anything else, but like finding a way to uniquely help people.
Absolutely. I wrote down, you said narrow and deep, and I think that's actually mastering it, right? Mastering each different segment of the market. And I can appreciate your thoughts on wealth management. I mean, I've been in asset management for 22 years, but having spent time in those years working with wealth managers, that's really where the great work is being done. Forget the numbers, forget the data, forget all of that. They're the ones, I know, because I work with my own financial advisor, helping you buy a house or send a kid to college, or that's where the real impact is being made. So I can appreciate the passion for that part of the market, and it's evolving so rapidly. It's catching us off our feet in some sense as we think about the last 10, 15 years.
Absolutely. And I think it was probably 2007, 2008, when the market started to fall apart. And I realized exactly how financial advisors reacted in the moment, right? The conversation very quickly changed from investment performance and returns, right, to risk management, life coach, psychologist, and yeah, I've realized that they were a co-pilot, right? They weren't a vendor or a service provider, right? And that they are all asked to stretch, right? Not necessarily just at that time, but at any particular point in time, if you have a life event for a moment. So no, I love this industry. I find it, really rewarding to be considered, to be part of it, right? And just the way the business has grown and evolved over the last, 10 to 15 years, you see the impact that, so many advisors, particularly in the RIA channel, are having on their and their families. And it's been, incredibly satisfying to kind of grow up with some of them.
For sure.
And a lot of room to grow.
Yeah. And I do want to talk about, I want to get into your pivot, your inflection point really into Echelon Partners, but I do want to make sure we kind of stick a pin in the work that you're doing to help support the wealth management industry through your current role.
Sure.
Because I think what you're doing with some of the RIA Edge and some of that work is incredibly compelling in supporting those firms in ways that they need it. But let's maybe take a pivot here. So, right, journalism, getting really narrow, really deep, mastering different parts of asset management within journalism, your passion for writing. And then we kind of take a right turn or a left turn or whatever it is, right? Let's talk for a second about what drove you to make that change to go more into research and the work that you were doing at Echelon.
So I effectively, while I was always in media, I think I stopped writing and editing in maybe 2010, 2011.
Okay.
I was really running a lot of our digital businesses, investment news. And that very quickly became digital and data, and digital and research. So for me, I built out a research division at Investment News. We acquired in 2009 the benchmarking studies from Moss Adams, which were hyper niche RIA benchmarking.
They were great studies.
Yeah, they still are. And I think, for me, that presented an opportunity. Those studies were really focused on compensation, staffing, right, financial performance. We expanded them so we can get more data and intelligence on technology. And after, worked very closely with Mark Bruno and his team over at Pershing on that.
Yeah.
I would love to be able to say that he was a mentor. We worked together, but not as closely. But from a distance, I was able to sort of learn how he owned the understanding of the RIA ecosystem, right, and sort of excellence within an RIA firm in a way that nobody else did. And we had discussions, and he talked about the importance of really owning and mastering a niche within a niche. And if you're the person who can provide, this is a guidance on what you should be paying a lead advisor, right, and how you should be structuring their incentive compensation, and what's worked and what hasn't. There were very few people, especially if you go back to 2009, 2010, there were very few people that knew how to do that. So
I went to one of his conferences actually when I was covering RIAs back in 2009, 2010 in Chicago. And it was I say this today, still the same. It is the only event I've ever attended where not a single person was on their phone.
Yeah.
Like everyone was just eyes straight ahead, listening, absorbing everything being shared.
That's the thing about the RIA business, right? Is probably if there are 37,000, 40,000 registered investment advisors, probably 10,000 that are legit wealth managers, right? Yep. Within that, every single one of them has a different way of thinking about growth, a different way of thinking about their org structure, right, and their design. So that's, from my perspective and sort of working through the research and helping to evolve that. I didn't realize it. I wish I did, or I could take credit for it at the time, but I was really dropping myself right into the middle of that ecosystem and had exposure to hundreds, if not thousands of RIAs, how they were growing, right? What they were doing to drive growth intentionally, right? And I also, more than anything, because the industry is so fragmented, an RIA isn't like opening up the door to his or her office, walking down the hall and talking to a peer who's a partner or a founder of another RIA firm, right? And saying, hey, I'm struggling, right, to convert some of these tax clients into wealth management clients. Like, what have you done? So, I and we in Investment News, we just sort of inserted ourselves into that conversation, and over time wasn't scalable, right? Because we'd get dozens of inquiries, right, in a given day or a week, and there was no answer, right? In some cases, it's like it depends. But that was one of the things that for me, I sort of very quickly transitioned out of traditional journalism, right, really more into research and data. And at the end, I always described myself as I was an RIA consultant in my last couple of years in investment news when I was doing what I loved. But it was, more of a one-to-many consulting job. And I didn't get to go as deep as I would have liked to, but it was a great opportunity to get to know some of the best firms that are in the market. And it's an amazing industry with incredible people. So very lucky for what that research platform led to and afforded me.
Oh, absolutely. I think that we always had a joke, not a joke, it's true. If you've met one RIA, you've met one RIA.
Hey, I think I said it on every RIA Edge podcast, actually.
Yes, it is. I mean, we said it back when I was at iShares and covering the RIA market. That's just what it was. And here at Flex, we've actually created a presentation to share with folks who don't have an understanding of that market. I should probably run it past the expert here in you and let you take a look at it, but just to help them understand the fragmentation that exists and kind of what they're dealing with and what matters to them. They are entrepreneurs, they are business owners, and all are in it for different reasons and have different structures and different businesses. And I mean, some of the larger RIAs, and I do, maybe we can pivot here actually, kind of think about the inflection points we've seen in that market. There's been these super RIAs created here in the last number of years, and so much M&A activity that's happening. What have been your observations as you think about these inflection points happening within that market?
So it was actually one of the things that drove me to Echelon. I knew Dan Siebert, the CEO, for a very long time. He's a researcher at his core as well. So we connected, and I saw all of the M&A activity that was happening, and also saw just how much more was going to happen. That I felt like, I want a front row seat for that.
So what's happening?
Spending some time at Echelon, I had that one-to-one consulting experience as opposed to the one-to-many that I talked about before. But it gave me access to what it was that was motivating both buyers and sellers. And then sort of more importantly than anything, you mentioned these like mega or these Uber RIAs. Those professional buyers were the ones who were on the other side of the table, 9 out of 10 times. So it gave me an opportunity to see not only how they structure deals, right, but how they position themselves. And more specifically, what problem does one aggregator or integrator solve for, right, for a seller compared with another one. And it's as much progress as they've made, as many deals as they've done, and as large as they've become, they're still in the early stages. They're still getting to the point, you see all the private equity money coming into the space. They're obviously deploying that, doing a number of acquisitions, but they're still building out their capabilities and the things that really differentiate them, but most importantly, the things that will unlock new growth, right? The things that make 1 + 1 equal more than 2. So, I think we've seen probably like 10 years of change in the last 2 to 3 years in the RIA space because of the merger and acquisition activity. I think last year there were probably, Echelon had about 300 and change deals that they tracked. There were probably a lot more than that that we just don't know about. You look at the last 3 years, you're probably close to 1,000 deals that have taken place.
Really? Wow.
And there's no way that doesn't completely transform the landscape, right?
Absolutely.
I don't even know that we've had enough time to properly digest it and draw any conclusions about how different the industry is today versus 4 or 5 years ago. That said, though, I do think we're starting to see with some of these larger platforms, whether it's a Hightower or it's a Crescent or CI, a little bit different, but you see these really large companies in the space now that I think are over time going to raise more awareness around the RIA segment and channel. And I still feel like it's a secret tucked inside of like the wealth management and
totally agree.
Services industry, right? The whispers are getting a little bit louder, obviously, when you start private equity to some extent, sovereign wealth and SPACs getting into the space. So, I mean, the secret is out, but I still think there's not as much understanding there. We're not far from, I think, a period where there are 25 or 50 firms that are responsible for 80 or 90% of the assets out there. What I don't know is how does that actually change the delivery of advice, right? And the sort of problems that advisors solve for their clients. That's the one question nobody asks, right? We talk about M&A all the time. Was it a good deal? Was it a bad deal? But nobody answers the question like, how has it changed things for better or for worse, right? For the clients of firms that have been acquired.
I think that's so true, because one of the things I was going to ask you, if you have thoughts on why, I think there's a lot of reasons why someone wants to be acquired: infrastructure, all different levels of support. And I think one of them, how can I create better outcomes for my clients through infrastructure support, better investment solutions, et cetera. But to your point, is that happening? We don't know, right? I think what you just described, though, with the 25 to 50 firms controlling 80 to 90%, I call that the institutionalization of retail. And you're seeing it happen in a host of different places through asset management. But if you look at it within wealth management, it's absolutely happening. The decision making is getting concentrated in the hands of fewer and fewer people as you look at to where the money actually sits within wealth management. So it's interesting, good, bad, or indifferent, right? Don't know. It's just a fact. And I do think it changes the way that people approach this market, and you have to, right? Fundamentally, given what's happening.
I think, one thing that has stuck with me just from like, I think about some of the conversations I had at Echelon. And there was one firm that I was talking to, is a $1 billion RIA. They were on the fence about whether or not they wanted to sell. But the owner was at retirement age, right?
Sure.
So he had to be thinking about it. And he just said, he's like, I'm getting calls every day from the 10 to 20 most active buyers. And their pitch is all the same, right? They said, let me take the compliance, let me take the back office, all the annoying stuff. We'll make your life easier. You can spend time with clients, you can manage money, you can go out and do business development. And his response to me was like, those things are annoying, but they're easy, right? I need help with the more complicated things, right? So when my clients have more sort of trust or estate planning issues that I don't have the expertise for in-house, how can you help, right? I think you're actually seeing some of the larger platforms now adding capabilities, whether it's trust and estate, or it's OCIO, or it's even outsourced, chief marketing officer. I think they are thinking about what are the sort of proactive, right, and sort of premium services that we can add, as opposed to how do we just help you scale, or how do we give you a better lifestyle. I think the firms that are the highest quality are the ones that are looking to grow actively. And they've probably figured out how to manage their compliance or their operations in a way where maybe it can improve, right? But it's not hindering their ability to perform or grow.
Systematic, and it's, to your point, it's not what's going to keep them back. They need help with complex situations for their clients or marketing or all those things you mentioned. I totally agree. So what is it then at wealth management, in your role and the work that I know you and I have talked about a lot, that you're doing with RIA Edge, the brand, right? Not just the event, because it is part of the Wealth Management Edge conference. What is it that you're doing, given all the background that you have in wealth management and the passion that you have for it? What is it that you're doing to support the RIAs in the market?
Sure. I think, I started about a year ago and got back into media and events because I saw an opportunity to really educate and inform, the upper end of the RIA community, and talk about a lot of the things that we've been discussing here. I think most of the problems or the challenges that a $1 billion plus RIA, for example, might have are related to growth. So, in my mind, looking at the opportunity with Informa, it was like, how do we help, right? People sort of solve for that, understand it, and go from, good to great, if you will, or from great to elite, right? So, at Informa, we run wealthmanagement.com on the event side, historically inside ETFs, WealthStack, part of the events portfolio. They were very separate businesses, right? So I came in to run both, bring them a little bit closer together. And the way, in my view, to really sort of truly integrate those businesses was to focus on people, right? Individually. Rather than speaking to an entire industry, how do we speak to, I use the term premium communities. It's not meant to offend anybody who's not part of it. But the fastest growing, the most complex, and the communities within the broader wealth management community that are the hungriest for research, data, journalism, and intelligence. And that's what RIA Edge is. It started with a podcast, where I kind of went down the list and interviewed a lot of the largest RIAs and talked about their challenges related to growth. Then it became rankings and data. Then it became an M&A and valuation workshop. And then in June, we have our main event, RIA Edge. And it's really, more than anything, I look at it as an omni-channel program that we've launched that is specifically for the leaders of very large, very influential, but also very curious
Yeah.
RIA firms, right? And it's not about managing money, right? What we talk about on RIA Edge, it's about managing the business. And the interesting thing there is like some of the people I'm talking to, they're the most successful people in the business, right? But they're motivated not by money, right? By mastery in a different, way. And they're trying to figure out, all right, I've done this. How do I get to, Mark Bruno Capital Management 2.0? And then what does 3.0 look like? And if they're really truly thinking long term, they're thinking about, you know what, I've got these 15 to 50 people on my team who probably created more growth than I have at this firm. How do I, when I sign off, make sure that they're set up right and that they're running the next generation of this firm and that they're set up for success right moving forward? So it's a different take on the RIA space. It's more personality, more purpose driven than it is news driven. But so far so good. We're getting a great response, and we appreciate the opportunity to talk about it. With you and others all the time, as you could tell, it's something that we're really passionate about.
Absolutely. It's quite clear. And I am too. And that's why I am excited to get down there and sort of see it. These are entrepreneurs at heart, entrepreneurs that are looking to grow their business. And to your point, have it live beyond them, most of them. And figuring out how to do that. And I think the intersection with technology and how they can use that to better serve their clients, better serve their teams, better grow their businesses, it gets more and more interesting too as we go forward. So I think it's fascinating. I'm super excited about what you're doing. I don't think journalism when I think RIA Edge. I think support. I think innovation. All these things that you're doing to try to help these firms grow. I think what's interesting about the RIA market. I know when I covered these firms, they had different study groups and they wanted to learn from one another. And so I think providing them that outlet is incredibly compelling. I have to imagine this probably some of the feedback you're getting and will get is to be able to provide that outlet for them to learn from you and others about how to better their businesses.
And that is when we talk internally about what we're trying to build, what we're trying to accomplish, and we talk about the community, I always fall back on that study group, right? Concept. I couldn't believe that they were actually doing this 15 years ago, right? On their own volition, just sort of going to a library and talking to 6 peers, right? For hours and about anything and everything. And it was maybe 3-4 years ago at Investment News, we had our 40 under 40 program, and we brought all the winners in for an awards luncheon, right? But before the lunch, they all asked, hey, could we come to your office and just do a short study group, right? For maybe like an hour or so before we get into the event. And here you have some of the youngest, most successful and most motivated individuals in the space. And they're like, can we get in at 7 a.m? Right? Like, what's the earliest we can get
Unbelievable.
So that's kind of how I look at RIA Edges, right? Even though you may have people who are running $1 billion, $2 billion, $10 billion firms, that peer-to-peer networking, that community is so important to them, right? And if we as a third party can play a small role in connecting people and helping them, right, at sort of a macro study group level, then we've accomplished everything we've set out to.
Absolutely. Well, you're describing talking to someone who also is building a community, right, to bring those firms in direct connection to asset managers and others within their sphere, right? So connecting advisors to advisors, advisors to asset managers, and so on and so forth. And so definitely speaking the same language as it relates to trying to create community for so many, whether in person or virtually, to be able to connect with one another.
Yeah, it's fun, it's rewarding, and in the end, when you're sort of building community and connecting community, you become part of it. Right?
That's it. Yeah.
So, that's the other part that's incredibly rewarding, right? It's not a product, right? It's not a project, right?
Yeah.
It's a passion if you get it right.
It's a community for sure. Maybe just to wrap up, I think you've had such interesting inflection points, and I think this idea of mastery, whether it be for yourself or talking about the RIAs that you're working with and have worked with and their mastery of their craft. Are there mentors? You mentioned that Mark was not a mentor technically, but have there been individuals, have there been people in your network that have helped you in your quest for mastery over the years that you continue to rely on?
Definitely. I mean, top of the list, without question, was my former boss at Investment News, Suzanne Syracuse, was the CEO.
Oh, Suzanne. Yeah.
And she was early on, somebody who saw I wanted to do different things. And while it may have been disruptive to some, She noticed that there's opportunity and potential there. So it was like, still remember the day. This is for another podcast, but like tapped me
Yeah.
on the shoulder, sat in her office for about 8 hours, and then we were attached at the hip for the next 10 years.
Wow.
So I learned a tremendous amount from her. And then along the way, I always look for, even if it's not an official mentorship, just opportunities to get 10, 15 minutes with people who are doing something that, like a good example, somebody like a Joe Duran, right?
Sure.
He has a completely different framework for thinking about financial advice and the role that a financial advisor plays, right? So even if you don't get an hour a week, right, with someone like that, if you get exposure to them at conferences, podcasts, and other just sort of platforms for really going into detail about transformation more than anything. I've always looked for people like that, right, who just have a completely different way of thinking, but also making an impact, right? So they have to, there have to be deeds and words, right, working together there.
Yeah.
So formal, official mentor, Suzanne, but I look at the Wealth Management All-Star team. There are a handful of icons and innovators who, from afar, I've observed. I put Joe and Mark at the top of the list. There's no question about that. And then, unfortunately, a lot of them will be at Wealth Management Edge too. Right?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Sort of a family reunion, if you will.
That's fantastic. I do think sometimes just spending 15 minutes with some of these people help you think about things in a completely different way.
Yeah.
That can lead to such a positive outcome.
Why are you doing this, right? Like to
Yeah.
get a sense for what motivates them. Is, I find, incredibly helpful at times. They may not talk about that on a panel or in a keynote, talk about it, openly in the office, but a podcast like this, which gives people the platform to talk about things that motivates them, right? I think you're doing sort of exactly what I was mentioning. When you're looking for motivation, when you're looking for mentors, and you're looking for inspiration, you're doing a great job of bringing some of this to eye level. So appreciate what you're doing for our business.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. I appreciate you saying that. As we wrap up, knowing that you play guitar, maybe we'll go to the listening part, but I always like to ask our guests, what are you currently reading or listening to? And listening to could be podcast, doesn't have to be music. I do a lot of podcast listening myself.
Right. I will say this is embarrassing, but with an event coming up with a couple thousand people, I'm not reading much right now. I'm reading email until about 11 p.m. at night.
That's right. Reading about panelists and attendees.
It's I still just, music is sort of the easiest, most efficient outlet for me, always, and especially right now. I've actually, in the last couple of months, just I've always loved Thelonious Monk, but for whatever reason, whenever there's a lot of noise, whether it's in your inbox, right?
Yes.
Having some of his classics, Straight No Chaser is my sort of go-to out, right? That has been an area where I spent a lot more time. So interestingly, I think I hadn't thought about it until you asked the question, but less words.
More music.
The most voices in your head, right?
Yes.
Tend to be the most powerful. So that's what's constantly spinning here, with a little bit of Miles Davis and John Coltrane.
That's awesome. All good choices. You mentioned Fish earlier. I'm gonna say talk about some music without words that'll get you. Always love to turn that on, and I had not thought about it in a while until you mentioned it.
I'm too old for it now, right?
I know.
I don't know what would happen to me if I was jumping on a trampoline playing.
Wonderful. Mark, thank you so much.
I appreciate that. I appreciate you having me on. Appreciate the opportunity here today.
Of course. Thank you.
The information contained in this recording is provided as is for educational and informational purposes only, and should not serve as the basis for any trading or investing decisions. Flex Networks makes no representations and disclaims all express, implied, and statutory warranties of any kind, any viewer, listener, or other third party. Neither Flex Networks nor any of its affiliates make any endorsement of any particular company, security, product, or financial strategy, and nothing contained in this recording should be construed as investment advice. Investors should undertake their own due diligence and carefully evaluate companies before investing.